The grand hall of the Valoran Empire stretched before Marcus Kane like a cathedral made of crystal and starlight, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into a shimmer of refracted light that seemed to bend reality itself. And he stood there in his simple gray diplomatic uniform, knowing that every eye in the room was measuring him and finding him wanting. Princess Lyra sat upon her throne of living metal, which shifted and flowed around her like liquid mercury frozen in time, and her violet skin gleamed under the light of a dozen floating orbs that circled the chamber, her eyes like pools of amber regarding him with barely concealed amusement. And beside her stood the imperial court, a collection of species from across 3 galaxies, all adorned in garments that cost more than most human colonies produced in a year. The human delegation had arrived on Valoran Prime 3 days ago, hoping to negotiate a trade agreement that would open the borders between human space and the Valoran Empire. And Marcus had been chosen as the lead diplomat because of his record, because of his patience, because someone back on Earth thought he could handle the pressure of representing a species that was still considered primitive by most of the galaxy. He had prepared for this moment, studying Valoran culture and customs, learning their concepts of honor and prestige, understanding that in their society, age meant wisdom and youth meant inexperience. And at 32 years old, he was already considered young by human standards. But among the Valorans who lived for centuries, he might as well have been an infant. Princess Lyra was only 19 by human reckoning, but she had been groomed since birth to rule, educated by the finest minds in the empire, trained in politics and warfare and the subtle art of negotiation. And she looked at Marcus now with the kind of disdain that came easily to those born into power, her lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. "So this is what humanity sends to treat with the Valoran Empire," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with crystalline clarity, each word precise and cutting. A single man, barely past his youth, representing a species that has only just learned to crawl between the stars. The court laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm, and Marcus felt the weight of their derision, but kept his face neutral. His hands clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed but not submissive. "Your Highness honors me with her attention," he replied, his voice steady, and he saw her eyes narrow slightly at his calm response. "I do not honor you," Lyra said, leaning forward on her throne. "I question the wisdom of my father in even allowing this meeting. For what could humanity possibly offer the Valoran Empire that we do not already possess in abundance?" She gestured around the hall, and Marcus followed her motion, taking in the displays of wealth and power, the courtiers wearing medals that did not exist in human space, the technology that made their ships look like toys, the casual arrogance of a civilization that had conquered a dozen star systems before humanity had even discovered fire. "We have resources," Marcus began, but Lyra cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Resources," she repeated, the word dripping with mockery. "We have strip-mined entire solar systems, human. We have technology that can convert stellar matter into whatever elements we desire. What could your meager worlds possibly provide that would interest us?" "Knowledge," Marcus said, and Lyra laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Knowledge from a species that has existed in space for less than 2 centuries?" she said, and the court joined her laughter. "What profound wisdom could you share with us, human? How to build primitive fusion engines? How to establish colonies on dead worlds? We mastered such things before your ancestors had even developed written language." Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not anger exactly, but a kind of tired resignation, because he had dealt with this before, with species who looked down on humanity, who saw them as upstarts and children playing at civilization. And he had always believed that patience and diplomacy would win through, that given time and effort, he could make them see what humanity had to offer. But looking at Princess Lyra now, at her 19-year-old face filled with absolute certainty, at the court that hung on her every word and reflected her prejudices back at her, he realized that no amount of patience would change her mind, that she had already decided what humanity was worth, and nothing he said would alter that calculation. "Perhaps your Highness is correct," he said quietly, and he saw surprise flicker across her face, as if she had expected him to argue, to plead, to try desperately to convince her of his species' value. "Of course I am correct," she said, recovering quickly. "Humanity has nothing to offer the Valoran Empire, and this meeting has been a waste of my valuable time." Marcus nodded slowly, and he felt the weight of failure settle onto his shoulders. The knowledge that he would return to Earth having accomplished nothing, that the trade routes would remain closed, that humanity would continue to struggle alone in its small corner of the galaxy. But he also felt something else, a kind of freedom, because he no longer had to pretend. "Then I will not waste any more of it," he said, and he turned toward the massive doors that led out of the hall. "You leave?" Lyra said, and there was surprise in her voice, now genuine shock, because apparently no one simply walked away from an audience with the Princess of Valoran. Marcus paused, but did not turn back, his hand resting on the smooth surface of the door, and he wanted to say something cutting, something that would wipe that smug expression from her face. But he found that he had nothing left to prove, no desire to engage in verbal sparring with someone who would never listen. "Yes," he said simply, and he pushed open the door and walked through it. The corridor outside was empty, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor, and behind him he heard voices rising in confusion and indignation. But he kept walking, past the guards who stood at attention, past the ornate chambers that lined the hallway, toward the landing bay where the human shuttle waited. 3 months later, Marcus sat in his small apartment on Luna Station, watching the news feeds with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, and the screen showed footage of Valoran Prime, of the planet's defensive fleet scattered like leaves in a storm, of the Imperial Palace burning with strange fire that consumed the living metal and turned it to ash. The Kryn had come, a species from beyond the galactic rim, older than the Valorans, more ruthless, more technologically advanced, and they had swept through Valoran space in a matter of weeks, crushing resistance, destroying fleets, occupying worlds with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. The news anchor spoke in somber tones about the fall of the Valoran Empire, about the casualties and the refugees, about the desperate calls for aid that the princess herself had sent to every species in the known galaxy. And Marcus set down his coffee and stared at the screen. They were showing footage now of Princess Lyra herself, no longer on her throne, but standing in the ruins of the palace, her violet skin smudged with ash, her amber eyes filled not with arrogance, but with desperation, and she was pleading for help, for any civilization that could spare ships or troops or supplies to aid in the defense of her people. The Galactic Council had refused, citing neutrality and the cost of intervention, and most of the major powers had done the same, because the Kryn were too strong, too dangerous, and no one wanted to risk their own worlds for the sake of an empire that had treated them with disdain for centuries. Marcus received the call 3 hours later, a priority message from Earth Command, and he listened as they explained the situation, as they told him that humanity had decided to intervene, to send a fleet to Valoran space, not because they owed the Valorans anything, but because it was the right thing to do. "They want you to go back," the Admiral said, her face serious on the screen. "They want you to deliver the message to Princess Lyra personally, to let her know that humanity is coming to help." Marcus thought about refusing, about telling them to send someone else, anyone else, but he found that he could not, because despite everything, despite the mockery and the dismissal, he remembered what it felt like to be desperate and alone, So he went, traveling back across the stars to Valeron Prime. And when he walked into what remained of the throne room, Princess Lyra looked up at him with eyes that held no recognition at first, and then widening surprise. "You," she said, and her voice was hoarse from shouting orders, from coordinating the defense of her dying empire. "Why have you returned?" Marcus looked at her, at this 19-year-old who had been so certain of her superiority, who now stood amid the ruins of everything she had known. And he felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a deep weariness. "Because someone has to," he said, and he told her that humanity was sending ships, that they would arrive within the week, that they would stand with the Valerons against the Kryn, regardless of the cost. Lyra stared at him, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked young, vulnerable, stripped of the arrogance that had defined her. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything I said, after how I treated you and your people, why would humanity help us?" Marcus turned to leave, having delivered his message, but he paused at the doorway and looked back at her one last time. "Because that is what humans do," he said, and then he walked away again, leaving her alone with